Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to step into a time when the world felt both familiar and terrifyingly fragile, when ordinary routines, bread baking, market chatter, church bells, ships docking, families sleeping in one room, could suddenly be interrupted by something invisible, unstoppable, and deeply misunderstood. Our story is about the Black Death, the Great Plague pandemic that swept across continents and reshaped daily life, belief, labor, trade, fear, and memory in the 14th century. We won't rush. We'll move slowly, like a lantern carried through a dark street, noticing details that people usually skip. How a town sounded at dawn, how a port smelled after rain, how rumors traveled faster than carts, how prayers and business continued until they couldn't, and how a disaster became part of the everyday. If you're here to relax, to listen, or to drift off while history unfolds like a long, quiet river, you're in the right place. Let's begin. When people say the word Titanic, they usually say it like it is a single moment, like it is one night, one crack in the dark, one famous sinking, and then the story ends, but the real shape of it is longer and quieter, because a ship like this is not born on the ocean, it is born on paper, in offices, in ledgers, in careful drawings that turn into steel, and then into schedules, and then into routines, and then into ordinary people doing ordinary work, and only after all of that does a ship finally become a headline. The Titanic was built in the early 20th century, when the North Atlantic route between Europe and North America was not just a travel option but a kind of modern artery, carrying letters, migrants, businessmen, wealthy tourists, crewmen who measured time in watches and whistles, and a steady stream of cargo that made the crossing feel less like an adventure and more like a service. A repeated pattern that companies tried to make smoother, faster, and more impressive each year, because in that era the ocean was still a wide barrier, but it was also a market. White Star Line wanted ships that were not only fast, but especially large and comfortable, ships that felt like floating hotels, and this is where Titanic begins to feel less like a myth and more like a business decision, because the ship was designed to be huge, stable, and luxurious, to carry many classes of passengers at once, to keep first class calm and quiet, to keep second class respectable and orderly, and to keep third class practical, crowded, and hopeful, with all of them moving in the same metal body but living in different worlds separated by doors, corridors, and rules. The ship was constructed in Belfast, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, in a place where enormous pieces of steel were shaped and joined together by thousands of workers, day after day, with the kind of repetitive labor that rarely becomes part of the romantic version of the story. Because when you think of Titanic you imagine chandeliers and grand staircases, but before those appeared there were rivets, heavy plates, cranes that lifted sections like a slow mechanical dance, and men who measured their work in aching shoulders and blackened hands, in heat and noise that made the idea of an elegant passenger lounge seem almost unreal. A ship this size is really a collection of systems, and the more you look at it the more you see that it was not one thing, it was 1,000 small things designed to work together, because it had boilers and engines, electrical systems, pumps, ventilation, galleys for preparing food, cold storage rooms, laundry spaces, sleeping quarters for crew, storage for linens, storage for coal. Storage for everything that allows a luxury environment to exist, and every system needed a routine, a person responsible, a set of instructions, and a way to be checked, because a ship is always moving and the ocean is always trying to shake it apart. People sometimes talk about how unsinkable ships were believed to be, and the word gets repeated because it makes the later tragedy feel sharper, but in everyday terms the more common truth is that large ships were built with safety features that seemed impressive at the time, like watertight compartments and doors that could be closed to limit flooding, and when a new ship was presented to the public, confidence was part of the sales pitch. Not necessarily as a magical claim, but as a feeling, a sense that modern engineering had made the sea less frightening than it had been for centuries. The Titanic was part of a trio of enormous ships for White Star Line, with Olympic and Britannic as sister ships, and even the word sister is interesting here, because it reminds you that these ships were not a one-time miracle. They were a plan, a pattern, a series, and Titanic's design had already been tested in a way by what was learned from Olympic, which sailed earlier. And in that sense Titanic was not the first of its kind, it was a refinement, a continuation, a promise that the company could deliver not just a ship, but a standard of experience. By 1912, the year Titanic sailed, the world was filled with a particular kind of confidence, the kind that grows when technology advances quickly and people start to assume that the next year will always be more modern than the last, and for many travelers the idea of crossing the Atlantic by a huge steamship had become less like facing nature and more like booking a service. And so the excitement around a new ship was often not about survival, it was about comfort, speed, status, and the quiet satisfaction of being part of something that looked like progress. Titanic's interiors were built to impress, but they were also built to manage crowds, to keep the flow of people smooth, to provide places where first-class passengers could feel private and protected from the noise of the broader ship, because class was not just a ticket type, it was a lifestyle that had to be maintained, and so there were dining rooms with specific rules, reading and writing rooms where silence was expected, lounges where people could sit and talk without shouting over engines, and corridors that could feel like a hotel hallway, with carpets and warm lighting that tried to make the ocean disappear. Second class was comfortable too, and that is something often forgotten, because in a story dominated by extremes, people tend to picture only the richest and the poorest, but second class was the world of teachers, clerks, small business owners, and families who wanted respectability without extravagance, and on Titanic this meant decent cabins, good food, and spaces where people could walk and gather without feeling like they were being punished, because second class was part of the ship's reputation as well. Third class, or steerage, was crowded and strict, but even there the experience could still feel like an upgrade compared to older ships, because regulations and company reputations mattered, and migrants were not simply thrown into the dark, they were organized, counted, fed, and kept within rules that had to do with health inspection, immigration processing, and the hard realities of moving thousands of people across an ocean that could still be brutally cold. The crew was the hidden population, the people who lived inside the machine of the ship, and their lives were a map of responsibility, because there were officers, sailors, engineers, firemen, stewards, cooks, cleaners, and many others whose names rarely appear in popular retellings, and yet without them the ship would not move, the food would not arrive, the beds would not be made, the coal would not be shoveled, the lights would not glow, and the grand experience would collapse into chaos. Coal was the ship's constant hunger, and a large liner like Titanic burned a tremendous amount of it, which meant that deep in the ship, far from the elegant staircases, men worked in heat and darkness, shoveling coal into furnaces, feeding the boilers, making steam, and turning that steam into motion, and if you imagine that work for long enough, you start to understand that the ship's luxury was built on relentless repetition, on sweating bodies performing the same action thousands of times, hour after hour, so that above them someone could sip tea and read a newspaper as if the ship moved by itself. And then, after the building and the planning and the training and the quiet routines, there comes a day when everything is ready enough to sell, ready enough to sail, ready enough to be photographed and admired, and the ship becomes a symbol, not because it wants to be, but because people want symbols, and the Titanic, huge and new, became a symbol of size, comfort, and the modern belief that the Atlantic could be made tame. Its maiden voyage was scheduled for April 1912, and the route was part of the well-worn pattern of Atlantic travel, leaving from Southampton in England, stopping at Cherbourg in France, then at Queenstown, Ireland, and then heading west toward New York, a path that sounds simple when you say it quickly, but is actually a complex choreography of arrivals, departures, tugs, docking schedules, passengers boarding and disembarking, luggage being sorted, and messages being sent, because even a single voyage was an operation involving many moving parts. On the day Titanic left Southampton, there was excitement, because it was a new ship, and there was ordinary noise, because ports are always noisy, and there were people who had no time to be impressed because they were working, checking lists, moving supplies, guiding passengers, counting bags, carrying trunks, sweeping floors, tightening ropes, and calling orders that had to be obeyed without discussion, because if a ship does not leave on time, the entire system behind it becomes embarrassed and expensive. The Titanic set off, and for a while the story was still just a travel story, a ship on a schedule, passengers finding their cabins, exploring hallways, learning where meals were served, figuring out what they were allowed to do and where they were allowed to walk, and in those first hours the ship is not yet a disaster, it is a place of small moments, a steward knocking politely, a meal arriving, a couple standing on deck feeling the wind, a child running down a corridor until a parent calls them back, and the ocean surrounding everything like a quiet background. This is the part of the Titanic story that feels almost unfair to remember, because it is calm, and because calm feels like it should be safe, and because people naturally want to believe that if something is calm then it will remain calm, but the Atlantic does not care about human feelings, and a ship's schedule does not protect it from ice, and progress does not cancel out the old rules of cold water and darkness and distance. Still, the first days of the voyage were routine in the way ocean travel could be routine, with meals served, announcements made, decks walked, and the ship continuing steadily west, and if you were on board at that stage you might have thought mostly about ordinary things, about sleep, about food, about conversation, about the way the air smelled different out at sea, about letters you might send when you arrived, and about the faint vibration of engines that became a constant companion, like the ship's slow heartbeat under the floor. And somewhere, far ahead, the North Atlantic carried its usual hazards, including ice drifting south from colder regions, and ships in the area sent wireless messages about ice, warnings that were part of the background of maritime life, because no ocean route was ever completely empty of danger, and radio operators often handled these messages while also carrying passenger telegrams, because even warnings had to compete with the daily business of communication. In the next part, we will move slowly through the ship's ordinary life on board, how the days were structured, what people ate, what they wore, what they did to pass time, how the crew worked through invisible shifts, and how warnings about ice became part of a growing pile of information that did not yet feel like a countdown, because in real-life disasters rarely announce themselves as disasters, they arrive inside routine, hidden in the same hours that once felt normal. By the second day of a voyage like this, the ship stops feeling like a dramatic object and starts feeling like a place with habits, because humans turn almost any environment into a routine if you give them enough hours, and on the Titanic the hours were designed to be filled in a controlled way, with meals and walks and rest, with polite rules that kept people moving smoothly, and with invisible labor that made the whole thing feel effortless to those who could afford not to see it. Morning on a large liner often began before most passengers were fully awake, because the ship's real morning belonged to the crew first, to the men and women who had to prepare spaces before anyone arrived to use them, so corridors were checked, floors were cleaned, brass was polished, and the quiet smell of soap and hot water drifted in places where passengers would later smell only fresh linen and breakfast. And if you had walked the ship early enough you might have noticed that the day was being constructed around you like a stage set, not in a dramatic way, but in a practical way, because a ship is a controlled world and it cannot afford to let disorder grow. In first class, the morning mood was usually calm, with the sense that the day could be shaped by personal choice, because luxury is often the freedom to do nothing without being punished by time, and so people might wake, dress slowly, and step into a corridor that felt like a hotel hallway, and then drift toward breakfast, where the act of eating was not only about hunger but about tradition, about sitting correctly, about choosing from a menu, about the quiet performance of being at ease. In a place that was carefully built to make you feel at ease. Food on the Titanic has become famous in modern retellings, not only because it was rich, but because it shows the contrast between classes, and the truth is that the ship was designed to feed large groups efficiently while still preserving an illusion of personal care, and that illusion required planning that was almost military in its detail, because ingredients had to be stored, measured, cooked, and served on time, and nothing could be easily replaced in the middle of the ocean, so kitchens and storage rooms were full of lists, and people who worked their thought in quantities rather than in emotions. First-class meals could stretch over many courses, not because people needed that much food, but because leisure loves extension, it loves turning simple acts into long rituals, and dining was an event, with stewards moving in practice patterns, with plates arriving warm, with conversation floating across tables in soft tones, and with the ocean outside as a distant, unseen presence. Because the dining rooms were meant to feel separate from the sea, as if the Atlantic were only a moving backdrop behind walls of wood and light. Second class had its own dining spaces, often with good food and a respectful atmosphere, and for many people this was the best balance, because it allowed comfort without the stiff performance of the highest luxury, and you could imagine a teacher or a clerk or a family of modest means feeling that this was still impressive, still a step up from older ships, still a sign that the modern world was becoming smoother, and that progress could be bought at different levels. Third-class meals were simpler and more crowded, and yet still structured, because order was necessary when you had many people living close together, and the ship's rules about movement and space were partly about class separation and partly about health and regulation, because steerage passengers were often subject to inspection upon arrival, and shipping lines did not want illness blamed on them, so third-class spaces, while cramped, were still managed with the careful attention of a system that wanted to appear responsible. Between meals there were hours that had to be filled, and people filled them in ways that reveal what they hoped the voyage would be, because some were crossing for business, some for pleasure, some for migration, and even when two people stood at the same railing looking at the same water, their thoughts could be completely different, one thinking about a meeting in New York, another thinking about a new life that was both terrifying and bright, another thinking simply about how cold the wind felt and how the ship seemed so steady that it was hard to believe it was moving at all. The ship's public spaces were designed to guide those hours, because boredom can become discomfort if it has nowhere to go, and a liner wanted to make sure that passengers could always find a proper place to be, so there were lounges, libraries, smoking rooms, and promenades, and the simple act of walking became an activity, not because walking is exciting, but because it is calming, and on a ship, calm is valuable, because calm makes people feel safe. On deck, the Atlantic could look endless and repetitive, and that repetition has a strange effect on the mind, because when the horizon refuses to change, your thoughts can become louder, and so some people talked more than usual, while others fell into long silences, watching waves and letting time stretch, and the ship's steady movement created a constant low vibration that could feel soothing, like a mechanical lullaby. And for those who were tired of the noise of cities, the oceans, emptiness could feel almost clean. At the same time, below deck, the steady rhythm was being maintained by work that did not pause for leisure, because the ship was a large machine and machines demand constant attention, so engineers monitored pressure, temperatures, valves, and gauges, and firemen and trimmers handled coal, feeding the boilers so the engines could keep turning, and this labor was hot and repetitive, and it was done in shifts that broke the day into blocks of exhaustion, and if you imagine that world long enough, you start to understand that speed at sea is not just a number, it is the result of bodies pushing fuel into furnaces hour after hour. The Titanic carried a wireless system, and that is another detail that sounds modern in a simple way, because it connected the ship to the outside world, allowing messages to travel through the air, and people on board could send telegrams, little pieces of personal life thrown into the invisible net of radio waves, and at the same time, the system also carried practical information, including warnings about ice. And this dual purpose created a quiet conflict of priorities, because passenger messages were profitable and demanded attention, while navigation warnings were essential and yet could blend into the background as one more item in a busy stream. The radio operators worked with headphones, signals, and the steady tapping language of Morse code, and their world was not the romantic bridge of a captain scanning the horizon, it was a small space of concentrated listening, and the messages they handled were not dramatic, they were often ordinary, and even the ice warnings could feel ordinary, because in the North Atlantic, ice reports were not rare in certain seasons, and routine can make even danger feel like paperwork. As the Titanic moved west, reports of ice began to arrive from other ships in the region, ships that had seen icebergs or fields of ice in the shipping lanes, and these messages were passed along, sometimes to officers, sometimes noted, sometimes folded into the larger pattern of information, and the important thing to understand is that information does not always create urgency, because urgency is emotional. And on a well-run ship everything tries to keep emotion under control, because panic is the enemy of order. And meanwhile, the passengers kept doing what passengers do, they wrote letters, They read books, they played cards, they talked in clusters, they visited friends in other cabins if they were allowed, they walked and walked again, and the ship became familiar enough that people stopped noticing it, which is exactly what a ship like Titanic wanted, because the more normal it felt, the more successful it felt, and normality is persuasive. It makes you believe that tomorrow will look like today. Even small rituals carried meaning, like the way people dressed for dinner, because clothing on the Titanic was not only protection from cold, it was a social signal, a way of saying, I belong here, or I respect the rules, and the rules themselves were a kind of comfort, because in a confined world, structure makes life feel predictable, and predictability makes people less anxious, and less anxious people are easier to manage. The officers and the bridge crew had their own routines, and in their world, the ship's movement was always being translated into numbers and judgments, course, speed, weather, visibility, and the kinds of notes that fill logbooks, because navigation is not a single heroic action, it is a continuous process of small decisions, and the ocean is never truly the same from hour to hour, even when it looks calm on the surface. April nights in the North Atlantic could be cold, and cold has a particular sharpness at sea, because it comes with wind and dampness, and it can make the air feel thinner, and as the ship continued, the temperature of the water and air would become a quiet detail that mattered more than most passengers realized, because colder waters meant a higher likelihood of ice. And ice meant that even a calm night could be dangerous if visibility was low. The Titanic's size created a sense of stability, and stability can create confidence, and confidence can dull the sharp edge of caution, because when a ship feels steady, you stop imagining what could knock it off balance, and you begin to assume that the ocean is simply a road, and the ship is simply a vehicle, and the only real challenge is waiting until the destination arrives. By the time the Titanic approached the region where ice reports were becoming more frequent, the ship was still doing what it had always been designed to do, moving efficiently and smoothly, with passengers sleeping and waking, eating and walking, and the ship's great internal systems continuing their endless work, and the tragedy, still ahead, was not visible yet as a shape, it was still only a collection of conditions, a colder sea, a darker night, a few warnings, a routine that had not yet been interrupted. In the next part, we will move closer to the final day, not by jumping straight to the collision, but by staying with the calm, with the specific details of April 14, 1912, the small choices, the ordinary moments on decks and in dining rooms, the ongoing radio traffic, and the subtle way the world on board continued to believe in its own safety, because that belief is what makes the later shock feel so sharp. And because understanding that belief helps you understand how disasters often happen. Not in chaos, but inside normal life. April 14, 1912 was a Sunday, and that detail matters more than it first seems, because Sundays carry a particular softness in the way people behave, even in places that are not truly at rest, and on a ship where time is already strange and stretched. A Sunday can feel like a long gentle ribbon of hours, where conversations slow down, where people are slightly more careful with manners, where the day seems designed to be remembered as pleasant, and the Titanic, moving steadily through the North Atlantic, offered exactly that kind of calm to anyone who stayed above the noise, above the heat, above the coal dust, above the hidden work that made the calm possible. To many first-class passengers, the day would have felt like a polished continuation of the ship's promise, the kind of day that makes you trust a place because nothing interrupts you, because meals arrive on time, because the corridors remain clean, because the lighting stays warm, because the ship does not roll violently, and because the ocean, when you look at it from a deck that is built for comfort, looks like something distant and obedient. A wide surface that moves, yes, but moves the way wallpaper moves when you walk past it, a background motion that does not demand fear. People woke in different ways, and those differences reveal class more honestly than any brochure ever could, because in first class waking meant privacy, it meant space, it meant the ability to wake slowly and decide when the world should meet you, while in third class waking could mean the world was already there, already close, already loud, already full of bodies and footsteps and shared air. And yet even in third class there could be a sense of hopeful routine, because migrants had endured worse than crowded ship quarters, and they often carried patience like a tool, a patient endurance that made them less shocked by discomfort and more focused on the future waiting across the ocean. The ship had religious services that day, and that is another quiet detail that matters, because religious services on a liner were partly about faith, and partly about rhythm, and partly about reminding people that the ship was still an orderly society with traditions, and so people gathered, listened, sang, sat, stood, and returned to their day feeling as if life had a stable shape, as if the world still followed rules that could be trusted, and trust, on a ship, is a powerful comfort. Because you are surrounded by water, and you cannot step away from the environment even if you want to, so you either trust it or you suffer. As the morning continued, you could imagine the ship as a collection of parallel worlds, because at the same time that one passenger might be choosing whether to read in a lounge or take a walk on the promenade, another passenger might be standing in line in a dining area, and below them, far below them, men were shoveling coal, and in between those layers were stewards who moved like quiet shadows, carrying trays, adjusting details, opening doors, closing doors, and keeping the ship's surface life smooth, because a luxury liner depends on the idea that nothing is a problem, that nothing needs effort, that everything is arranged by invisible hands. The weather had grown colder, and cold at sea is not like cold on land, because there is no shelter except what the ship provides, and the wind has an edge to it, a thin sharpness that cuts through fabric if you stand still too long, and so people who wanted to walk on deck might have wrapped themselves more carefully, pulling coats tighter, wearing hats, tucking hands into pockets, and you can picture the way their breath might have looked faintly visible in the air, a small sign that the ocean around them was not warm and friendly but cold and serious, even if it looked calm. Ice warnings continued to exist in the ship's background like a distant murmur, and this is one of the most important and least dramatic parts of the story, because modern minds want a clear moment when everyone knew, but on that day knowledge was not a single sharp thing, it was a pile of messages, a stream of reports from other ships, and the challenge was not that warnings did not exist. The challenge was how the ship's busy communication system handled them, how they moved through people and procedures, how they were prioritized against passenger telegrams, how they were noted, how they were interpreted, and how the ship's confidence shaped the emotional weight those warnings were allowed to have. The radio room was a small space for a task that feels almost magical when you imagine it in 1912, because wireless messages traveled through air, and that meant the Titanic was not completely isolated. It could speak, it could listen, it could connect, and yet the radio operators were working under pressure because passenger messages were numerous, especially on a prestigious voyage. And each passenger message was a small piece of private life that the company could charge for, and so the Operators were not sitting peacefully waiting for danger reports, they were busy, tapping and listening, sending and receiving, and when warnings arrived, they arrived into a crowded room of signals. At different times that day, ships in the area reported ice, and the messages were not written like poetry, they were practical, they described positions, they described the presence of icebergs or fields of ice, they were meant to be read, noted, and used, and on a ship like Titanic such warnings could be delivered to officers, could be written down, could be considered, and yet still not create a sense of immediate crisis. Because in maritime life danger is always there in some form, and people who work at sea build mental habits to keep fear from interfering with function. As the afternoon approached, passengers continued to do what passengers do when they feel safe, they planned nothing urgent, they thought about dinner, they chatted, they played games, they leaned over railings to look at the water, and some of them probably commented on the cold, and the comment would have been casual, the way people comment on weather without believing weather can become a knife, and below them the machinery continued, the ship's engines turning with that steady, almost comforting vibration that makes a person think, without realizing it, that movement equals control. Meals, again, were anchors for the day, because when you eat at fixed times you feel that time is stable, and on the Titanic dinner in first class was an event that encouraged people to dress well, to sit long, to talk in ways that did not need to end quickly, and the lighting in those rooms was designed to make faces look warm, to make wood glow, to make the ship feel like a floating building rather than a vehicle racing through dark water. And if you sat in that light it would have been hard to imagine that outside, the ocean was becoming a darker, colder, more dangerous environment. In second class and third class, dinner mattered too, but differently, because for many second-class passengers, good food was part of the satisfaction of the ticket, proof that they had chosen well, and for third-class passengers, a steady meal could be a form of reassurance, a reminder that the company was still serving, that the ship was still functioning, that the crossing was continuing, and that the future, though unknown, was at least being carried forward by the schedule. As daylight began to fade, the ocean became a different stage, because darkness at sea is not the same as darkness on land, there are fewer reference points, fewer lights, fewer shapes, and the horizon becomes harder to read, and the cold can deepen quietly, and the stars can look sharp and bright, and that beauty can be misleading, because a clear night feels like safety, and yet a clear night can also mean that the air is still, and still air can mean that the surface of the water is calmer. And calm water can make it harder to see certain things, including ice, because waves that break against an iceberg can sometimes reveal it, while a glassy sea can hide shapes that do not disturb the surface in an obvious way. The crew's routines shifted as evening came, and there were watch changes, orders exchanged, small checks performed, and the ship moved on, and what is haunting about this phase is that it is filled with ordinary professional behavior, not with villains and not with madness, but with people doing what they had done before, relying on experience, relying on procedures, relying on the belief that modern ships and trained crews and careful navigation could handle the Atlantic. Some passengers went to bed early, because not everyone loves late-night social life, and some passengers stayed up, because the ship offered music, conversation, perhaps cards, perhaps a sense that the voyage itself was a rare social space, a place where you could meet people you would never meet on land, and when you are in such a space you can become slightly careless in your mind, because you are distracted by the novelty of being in transit, and transit always feels like a pause from Real life. Down below, the engine rooms and boiler rooms continued their relentless pace, and that is worth returning to again and again, because the ship's speed depended on those spaces, and those spaces were not romantic. They were practical, hot, loud, and filled with sweat and soot, and the men there would have measured time not by the beauty of the sea but by shifts and fatigue, by the taste of coal dust, by the ache in the arms, by the constant need to feed the ship's hunger for fuel, and in a way. The Titanic was always burning time, converting coal into motion, converting human effort into miles traveled, and that conversion continued regardless of what the night was becoming. As the ship entered regions where ice was more likely, the idea of hazard existed as a professional concept, not a passenger concept, because passengers do not normally imagine icebergs the way officers do, and officers do not normally speak of danger to passengers unless they must, because fear spreads, and fear on a ship is expensive and difficult to control, so the ship's surface life remained calm. And calm is contagious too, it keeps people smiling, keeps them trusting, keeps them staying inside the warm rooms instead of clustering outside in anxiety. One of the quiet tragedies in the Titanic story is that many passengers were probably not thinking about the ocean's physical reality at all, not thinking that the water around them was close to freezing, not thinking what that would mean for a human body, not thinking that lifeboats are not simply boats, but a limited resource that must be launched in order, not thinking about the way darkness makes coordination harder, not thinking about the way distance makes rescue slow, and this is not because they were foolish, it is because modern life trains people to assume that systems will work, that someone else has planned for every possibility, and on Titanic that assumption was part of the experience being sold. And as the night deepened, messages about ice still existed, still traveled, still tried to fit into the ship's busy stream of communication, and the bridge still maintained course and speed according to its understanding of conditions, and the lookout still watched the sea ahead, and in that watching there is another quiet detail, because watching at night is a kind of strain, your eyes search for contrast, for shape, for movement, and if the sea is calm and the air is cold and the sky is clear, you can feel almost hypnotized by the emptiness, and emptiness can make the mind relax in the worst possible way, because the brain starts to expect nothing, and when the brain expects nothing, it sometimes fails to recognize the shape of danger until the last moment. We are getting close now, but we are not going to rush, because the real story is not only the collision, it is the final ordinary minutes before the collision, how the ship's life continued as if it had all the time in the world, how conversations continued, how laughter continued, how some people slept without knowing anything was wrong, and how the ocean ahead held its silent obstacles without announcing them. In the next part, we will move into the late evening of April 14th and the early minutes of April 15th, staying close to the human scale of time, the specific sensations of cold air, the quiet on deck, the small actions on the bridge, the small movements below deck, the moment when a shape appears ahead, and the way the entire world of the ship begins to change, not instantly like in a movie, but in stages, as information spreads unevenly and people struggle to understand what has happened, because the first reaction to disaster is often not panic, but confusion, and confusion is slow, and in those slow minutes the fate of many people is quietly decided. As April 14th slid into late evening, the Titanic began to feel like a quieter version of itself, not because it was less alive, but because the ship's life was shifting into night mode, the way a large hotel becomes softer after dinner, the way voices drop slightly, the way footsteps become fewer, the way doors close more often, the way light becomes warmer and more deliberate, and on a ship. Night has its own rules because the outside world turns black and the inside world becomes the only world you can easily see. Some first-class passengers stayed awake for late conversation, for cards, for smoking room talk, for music, for the comfortable sense that a long day was ending properly, while others had already retreated to cabins, because the steady vibration of the engines and the gentle, almost unchanging movement of the ship could make sleep come easily, and when sleep comes easily, people trust the environment. And that trust becomes almost automatic, like breathing, like blinking, like assuming that tomorrow will arrive the way it always does. Second class had its own quiet evening patterns too, and third class as well, where families and groups settled into cramped but familiar spaces, where the closeness of bodies made the air warmer even when the ship itself moved through cold water, where someone might have laughed softly at a small story from home, where someone else might have stared upward and imagined New York like a bright idea rather than a real city, and the ship, carrying all these different personal worlds at once, kept going west as if the ocean were simply a corridor between two rooms. Up on deck, the cold was stronger now, and the kind of cold that does not shout, but insists, the cold that makes you aware of your own skin, your own breath, your own fingers, and you could picture the dark sea under the stars, the horizon faint, the water sometimes so calm that it looked like a surface without texture, and in such calm, a person can lose their sense of speed. Because speed on water is hard to feel unless the wind is loud or the waves are high, and if the sea is smooth and the air is still, the ship's movement can feel deceptively gentle, like gliding rather than charging forward. And that gentleness, that quiet, is part of what makes the story of that night so unsettling, because danger did not arrive with dramatic weather or obvious chaos, it arrived inside stillness, and stillness can make people less alert in ways they don't notice, because the brain uses change as a signal, and when there is little change, the brain relaxes, and when the brain relaxes, it becomes harder to detect a pale shape ahead in a dark world. On the bridge, the ship's officers were doing their night work the way officers do night work, checking positions, keeping the ship on course, working within procedures that were meant to keep everything calm, because the goal of a voyage is not excitement, the goal is continuity, and continuity is built from small repeated actions, the steady reading of instruments, the steady exchange of information, the steady expectation that the ship will behave like a ship, and the ocean will behave like an ocean, and trained people will handle whatever needs to be handled. Somewhere near the top of the ship, the lookouts were in their post, watching ahead, and the job of a lookout sounds simple until you imagine doing it in cold air for long stretches, staring into darkness, scanning for anything that breaks the shape of the night, and the challenge is that the human eye is not a perfect instrument, it gets tired, it is fooled by contrast, it is limited by the conditions of the air and the sea. And that night the conditions were the kind that can reduce the ocean to a smooth black surface, where an iceberg does not announce itself with white foam or bright disturbance, where it can sit like a silent wall, and where spotting it becomes a race between distance and reaction time. At the same time, the wireless room continued to live in its own reality, because radio work does not feel like standing outside in the cold, it feels like being inside signals, and those signals carried many things at once, passenger messages, company messages, navigation messages, and among them were ice warnings, and the key thing to understand is not simply that warnings existed, but that the ship's overall attention was divided the way attention always is in real life, divided by workload. By routine, by the feeling that there is still plenty of time, by the ordinary human tendency to put immediate tasks first, and that tendency is not evil, it is normal, and normality is exactly what was operating on the Titanic right up to the moment it could no longer pretend that the night was ordinary. When the iceberg finally entered the story in the most direct way, it did not enter as a name, it entered as a shape, a pale block against blackness, an object that the eye did not immediately want to believe in, because the mind tries to interpret the world as familiar, and empty ocean is a familiar interpretation, while ice wall ahead is not, and the delay between seeing and believing can be only seconds, but seconds matter at speed. The lookout's warning, once it came, became a signal that traveled fast through the ship's chain of command, and what followed was a burst of decision-making compressed into a short time, and again, it is important to imagine this without movie drama, because real decisions are made by people using training and instinct under pressure, calling orders, turning wheels, attempting to change the ship's path, attempting to reduce the impact, attempting to do the one thing the ocean rarely allows at the last moment, which is to avoid consequences. The ship responded the way a huge object responds, not instantly, not like a small boat, but with slow authority, a turn that takes time, because the Titanic was enormous and momentum is not a suggestion, it is a law, and even when a ship begins to turn, it continues forward, and the distance between spotted and passed safely can vanish quicker than anyone wants to admit. Then came the contact, and one of the strangest parts of the Titanic's sinking is that for many people the first sensation was not a violent shock, but something subtle, something that could feel like a shiver or a scrape or a small wrongness, because the iceberg did not slam into the ship like a hammer from above, it pressed along the side in a way that could register differently depending on where you were. And that difference in experience created a difference in understanding, because if you felt only a mild vibration you might think it was nothing serious, and if you heard only a distant sound you might assume it was routine mechanical noise. People in some cabins woke and sat up, confused, listening, waiting for a second signal that would tell them whether they should worry, and many did not get that second signal immediately, because the ship did not instantly transform into chaos, and that delay is part of the tragedy, because the first minutes after disaster are often filled with uncertainty, and uncertainty slows people down. And slow movement in a limited time situation becomes dangerous in a way that no one can fully calculate in the moment. On the bridge and among officers, the situation began to sharpen quickly, because certain kinds of information reached them first, changes in the ship's condition, reports from below, the understanding that something serious has happened, and even then the mind has to accept it, because accepting a major problem is not just an intellectual action, it is an emotional threshold. And crossing that threshold means you must now behave differently, you must now treat the ship not as a stable world but as a failing one. Below, in the engineering spaces, there would have been the first practical consequences, water where water should not be, alarms or urgent messages, men moving faster, checking, confirming, trying to understand which compartments were affected, because damage in a huge ship is not a single thing, it is a map, and that map determines whether the ship can stay afloat or not, and in the Titanic's case, the damage was the kind that made the future narrow quickly, because the ship's design could handle certain flooding scenarios, but only within limits, and that night the limits were being exceeded. For passengers, the ship still looked like the ship, lights still worked at first, corridors still existed, the air still smelled like the ship, and that familiar environment can trick the mind into calm, because humans trust what looks normal, and if the lamps are on and the carpet is under your feet and the walls are not shaking, it is difficult to believe you are in a life-threatening situation, so people asked small questions. What was that? And then tried to answer themselves in small ways, probably nothing, because probably nothing is the easiest story to live in when the alternative is too heavy. Stewards and crew became messengers of mood, because the way staff behaves can change how passengers behave, and staff are often trained to maintain calm, to avoid panic, to speak politely, to guide people without frightening them, and this is sensible in many situations, because panic causes injuries and confusion, and yet in the Titanic situation, calm also risked being interpreted as safety, and safety risked becoming delay. As orders began to move through the ship, you can imagine small scenes repeating in many places at once, doors opening, a steward speaking quietly, a passenger sitting up in bed, someone putting on a robe or a coat, someone asking whether they should dress warmly, someone else laughing nervously at the idea of being told to go on deck at night, and all of it happening in a strange half-awake state, where people are not fully present yet, because they have been pulled out of sleep and into uncertainty, and the human brain is slow to shift from dream logic to survival logic. Up on deck, the cold felt sharper now because people were being asked to step into it, and stepping into cold air at night is itself a kind of shock, and you could see breath, you could see silhouettes, you could see the ship's lights reflected faintly on surfaces, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean was still dark, still indifferent, still doing nothing that looked dramatic. And the contrast between calm sea and urgent orders is one of the most unsettling parts, because it makes the emergency feel like it has no background music, no obvious stage, only a quiet night and a ship full of people trying to understand. Lifeboats existed as a concept long before they existed as an action, and that is another quiet truth. Because most passengers know lifeboats like they know fire exits in a building, they are there, but you do not imagine using them, you do not rehearse the moment, and when the moment comes, the reality of them can feel unreal, because now you are standing near small boats while looking at a ship that still looks too big to fail, and your mind struggles with the idea that you might be leaving the ship behind, because leaving the ship behind feels like admitting it is doomed. And even as the lifeboat process began, it did not begin like a single coordinated wave, it began in pieces, because organization under surprise is always uneven, different areas receive orders at different times, different officers interpret urgency differently, different crew members communicate in different ways, and passengers themselves respond differently, some quick to comply, some reluctant, some unable to understand why they should leave warmth for cold, why they should climb into a small boat when the ship itself is still upright and brightly lit. There was also the constant barrier of class and access, not always as deliberate cruelty in each moment, but as the built-in structure of the ship, because the Titanic was designed with separations, gates, corridors, and rules, and in an emergency, those structures do not instantly dissolve, they have to be navigated, and navigation takes time, and time was becoming more precious with every quiet minute. The crew had to do something incredibly difficult in a controlled way, which is to create urgency without creating chaos, and you can picture officers calling instructions, crew members checking lists, dealing with confusion, dealing with questions, dealing with resistance, dealing with people who wanted to go back to their cabins for jewelry or papers, dealing with people who did not want to be separated from family members, dealing with people who did not speak the same language as the instructions being given, and all the while, the ship's condition was worsening in a way that could not be fully felt in every corridor at once. One of the most haunting aspects of the Titanic's sinking is that it was a slow enough disaster to allow thought, and thought can be painful, because in a sudden catastrophe you act instinctively, but in a slow catastrophe you have time to argue with reality, you have time to doubt, you have time to tell yourself stories, you have time to hesitate, you have time to think, this cannot be happening, and that sentence alone can cost minutes. As the minutes passed after the collision, the Titanic did something that large systems often do when they are failing. It tried to behave as if it was still stable, and that half stability is one of the reasons the evacuation was so psychologically difficult, because the ship did not immediately look like a sinking wreck, it still looked like a functioning world with electric light, polished wood, carpets, and familiar corridors. And when the environment looks familiar, the human mind keeps trying to act familiar too, even when the situation no longer deserves that comfort. The first real shift came not from a single announcement that everyone heard at once, but from a growing pattern of small instructions, small movements, small clusters of people drifting toward deck areas, and you can imagine how uneven that would feel, because some cabins would be woken promptly while others slept longer, some passengers would get clear guidance while others would hear rumors. Some would see crew preparing lifeboats and understand immediately that this was serious, while others would see nothing at all and assume it was a minor delay, and this unevenness matters because in an emergency, time is shared by everyone but information is not. Stewards were in the uncomfortable role of trying to keep things calm while also moving people toward action, and that balance can look like contradiction, because, "Please remain calm," and, "Please come to the deck," are sentences that fight each other inside the mind, and a person who is half awake, pulled out of sleep, hearing polite words, may interpret politeness as safety, because politeness is a language of normal life, and it is hard to imagine death arriving politely. So people dressed, and the act of dressing became a strange ritual, because it was practical and symbolic at once, practical because the air was cold and the night was colder, and symbolic because clothing can feel like control when you have very little control, so people put on coats, put on hats, wrapped scarves, and in some cabins there were arguments about what to take, whether to bring valuables, whether to bring documents, whether to leave them behind, and the tragedy of such arguments is that they are not stupid, they are human, because in a crisis people cling to what feels permanent, and money and papers feel permanent, even when water does not care. When passengers began to arrive on deck, the cold became a new kind of shock, and you can picture the moment a warm interior becomes an open night, a shift from soft lamplight to hard starlight, from steady carpet to hard deck, from enclosed air to wine that stings the face, and it is in that transition that many people would have realized something important, not necessarily that the ship would sink, but that the situation was not nothing, because you do not send people into freezing air at midnight for a simple inconvenience. The lifeboats themselves were a difficult idea for the mind to accept, because they were small compared to the ship, and humans judge safety partly by size, so the ship felt safe because it was enormous, while the lifeboat felt risky because it was exposed, and this created a basic psychological resistance that officers and crew had to fight against, because they were asking people to leave the solid familiar world for a small open one, and without the knowledge of what was happening below decks. Many passengers did not feel the correct urgency. At first, the lowering of lifeboats could look almost calm, almost orderly, like a drill, because a ship is designed to perform operations with ropes and pulleys, and the sea that night was relatively calm, which is a strange mercy because it made launching possible without immediate waves smashing the boats, and yet calm sea also made the danger feel less visible, because if the water looks peaceful, it is harder to imagine it as an enemy. The officers had to make decisions under pressure, decisions that were not only technical but social, because they were deciding who goes first, how to interpret maritime rules and traditions, how to manage the crowd, how to ensure the boats were loaded and lowered safely, and a famous principle used in such situations was to prioritize women and children. And that principle sounds simple until you place it into a real crowd where families are mixed, where language barriers exist, where some people hesitate, where some men argue, where some women refuse to leave husbands, where some children are asleep and must be carried, and where no one has a clear picture of how much time remains. This is one of the cruel ironies of a slow disaster, because a slow disaster gives people time to debate, and debate is not always helpful, because while people debate, the physical reality continues, water continues to move where it should not be, the ship continues to lose its stability, and the clock does not pause for human confusion. Meanwhile, below decks, the ship's internal geography became more important than ever, because Titanic's class structure was built into corridors, gates, and stairwells, and even if no one intended cruelty in each individual moment, the structure itself created obstacles, and obstacles become deadly when time matters, so third-class passengers, who lived deeper inside the ship, had a harder time reaching the lifeboat areas quickly, and they also had less access to fresh information, and that lack of information creates hesitation, because when you don't know what is happening, you don't know what you are allowed to do, and on a ship with strict rules, permission can feel like another locked door. The ship's lights remained on for much of the process, and that matters, because darkness creates panic faster than almost anything. And as long as the lights are on, the mind keeps insisting that the world is stable, that the system is working, that there is still order, and crew members use that order as a tool, trying to keep people moving in lines rather than in surges. Some people, especially those in first class, would have encountered the emergency through a lens of authority, because they were used to being guided by staff, used to being told what to do in refined language, and that refined language can be comforting even when it is misleading, because it makes the situation feel controlled, and control is what everyone wants to believe in. Others, especially those who had lived through hardship before, might have sensed the seriousness quicker, because hardship teaches you that systems can fail, that safety can vanish, that polite words do not guarantee outcomes, and you can imagine the way some migrants might have watched the crew's faces rather than listen to their words, because faces reveal urgency better than announcements. Out on the water, once the first lifeboats were lowered, the world split into two perspectives, the perspective of those still on the ship, surrounded by light and structure, and the perspective of those now in a small boat on a dark ocean, looking back at a huge glowing liner that still looked almost impossibly alive, and that sight could confuse the mind in a new way, because from a distance the ship could look even safer than it felt up close. And the instinct in such a moment is to think, Surely this is temporary, surely we will go back, surely the ship will not actually leave us behind. The wireless distress signals became a thread connecting Titanic to the outside world, and that thread carried both hope and helplessness, because radio can reach far, but ships cannot move instantly, and the ocean at night is still distance, and distance is time, and time was what Titanic did not have enough of. Some nearby ships received the distress messages, and some responded, and one of the most important responders was the Carpathia, which began moving toward Titanic's position as fast as it could, but, as fast as it could, was still limited by the nature of steamship travel and by the very same ice that was part of the danger, because rushing through ice fields is not simply bravery, it is also risk. And so rescue itself had to navigate the same cold reality. There was also another ship in the broader story, the Californian, which has become famous in Titanic history because it was in the area and because its actions and inactions have been debated for a long time, and regardless of the debate, what matters in the immediate human sense is that when you are on a sinking ship, you are not thinking in historical arguments, you are thinking, will anyone arrive in time? Will any lights appear on the horizon? Will the dark ocean become crowded with help? Or will it remain empty? Back on Titanic, as lifeboats continued to be prepared and lowered, the process faced a constant enemy. Hesitation, because some boats were lowered not fully filled in the earliest phase, partly because people were reluctant to enter them, partly because officers were trying to avoid overcrowding that could cause a boat to fail at the moment of lowering, partly because the situation still did not feel fully real to many, and the combination of these factors created a painful pattern. Boats leaving with empty space while people still remained on board. And as time continued, the ship's physical condition became harder to ignore, because a ship does not sink evenly in a way the mind can accept calmly, it changes its posture, it changes its angles, and those changes affect how people move, how doors open, how water sounds inside the structure, and once a slant becomes noticeable, reality becomes more persuasive, because the human body senses tilt. And tilt tells you that the world is no longer stable. As the seriousness became clearer, behavior changed, and you can imagine the mood tightening, like a room where the air suddenly feels thinner, where voices get sharper, where people stop making jokes, where silence appears in short heavy blocks between commands, where the polite social masks begin to crack, because fear is not polite, and fear reveals what people truly value, who they cling to, what they refuse to leave behind. Families struggled with separation, because women and children first is not emotionally simple, and you can imagine a husband trying to act brave while also trying to negotiate for his wife to stay with him, a wife refusing to enter a boat without her husband, an officer insisting on rules, a child crying because they do not understand why they are being moved like luggage, and in those moments, the Titanic story becomes less about the ship and more about human bonds under pressure. For crew members, this was work under the worst conditions, because they were trying to execute a plan on a ship that was changing under their feet, and they were doing it while watching passengers react in unpredictable ways, and even trained people can become overwhelmed, not necessarily with panic, but with exhaustion and overload, because emergencies are loud even when they are quiet, loud in the mind, loud in the need to keep track of too many variables at once. The ship's officers also had to live with the knowledge that they could not save everyone in the simplest way, because lifeboat capacity and logistics were limitations, and limitations are brutal because they are mathematical and indifferent, and that indifference can feel like betrayal to people who assumed modern progress meant unlimited safety. And still, Through all of this, the ocean remained calm and dark, and that calm is part of the horror because it refuses to match the human emotional crisis. The sea does not scream, the sea does not rage, it simply waits, and the stars above do not dim out of sympathy, and this mismatch between human urgency and natural quiet makes the scene feel unreal, like a nightmare where the world looks normal while your life collapses. As more lifeboats left the ship, the space on deck changed, because every boat lowered removed not only people, but also hope of normal resolution, because the act of leaving is an admission that the ship will not quickly recover, and each boat drifting away was like a sentence ending, a period placed on the illusion that Titanic could simply continue. In the next part, we will follow that tightening spiral further, how the last phase of evacuation differs from the first, how the ship's posture becomes more dramatic, how decisions become harsher because time is shorter, and how the ocean around the Titanic begins to fill with a scattered constellation of small boats, each holding people who look back at a glowing giant that still seems impossible to lose, and yet is already in the process of disappearing. As the night pushed forward, the Titanic entered the stage where denial becomes harder to maintain, not because everyone suddenly becomes wiser, but because the ship itself begins to communicate in a language that bodies understand, a language of angle, of strain, of unfamiliar sounds, of doors that no longer sit perfectly in their frames, of a floor that makes your feet adjust without permission. And once the body starts correcting for a tilt, the mind follows, because the mind can argue with rumors, but it struggles to argue with balance. Earlier in the evacuation, hesitation had been one of the main obstacles. People questioned the need to leave, questioned the logic of entering a small boat, questioned whether the danger was real, but as time passed and the ship's posture changed, the crowd's mood shifted from skepticism to urgency, and this change did not happen like a dramatic switch, it happened the way temperature changes, gradually enough that you only notice it when you realize you have started shivering. On deck, the atmosphere became more crowded in places and more empty in others, because lifeboats already launched meant some sections had thinned out, while other sections became bottlenecks, and the ship's design, which had once been a symbol of luxury, now became a complicated maze under stress, because passages that felt elegant in the afternoon could feel narrow at midnight when people needed to move fast, and staircases that looked grand in brochures could become choke points where strangers pressed together, trying to understand where they were supposed to go. Crew members, stewards, officers, and sailors became the nervous system of the ship, carrying information and instructions from one part to another, and the quality of that information varied, because in emergencies, even true information arrives in fragments, and fragments can be misunderstood, and misunderstandings spread quickly in crowds because people prefer any story to uncertainty, and if someone hears, "Everything is fine," they will cling to it, and if someone hears, "The ship is sinking," they will spread it, and the ship itself becomes filled with competing sentences, each one reshaped as it moves from mouth to mouth. The work of launching lifeboats became both more urgent and more difficult, because urgency pushes people to rush, but rushing around ropes, pulleys, and equipment can create mistakes, and mistakes can be costly, so officers had to push speed while still demanding order, and that balance is exhausting, because every lifeboat needs to be brought into position, filled, checked, lowered, and then moved away, and each step requires coordination among many hands, and coordination becomes harder as anxiety rises. There is a strange way that rules become both stronger and weaker in a disaster like this, stronger because people cling to rules as a way to create fairness, and weaker because the physical situation begins to break the environment that makes rules easy to enforce, and you can imagine officers insisting on women and children first, insisting on lines, insisting on calm, while at the same time facing more resistance simply because time felt shorter now, because people could sense, even without understanding details, that the ship's future was narrowing. Families continued to fight the hardest emotional battle, which was separation, because the idea of stepping into a boat while someone you love remains behind feels unnatural, and what makes it worse is that you cannot see the outcome clearly. You cannot know whether the ship will stay afloat long enough for others to follow. You cannot know whether rescue will arrive in time. You cannot know whether you are making the correct choice. And uncertainty makes every decision feel like a gamble, and humans do not like gambling with the people they love. In those moments, it is easy for history to become cold and judgmental, to ask why someone did not do this or that, but on the ship that night the real challenge was not intelligence, it was emotional reality, because fear does not make people think in clean lines. Fear makes them think in loops, returning again and again to the same question, is it really that bad? And then returning again and again to the same answer, it might be. And that loop wastes time, but it is also a very human way to protect the mind from shock. Meanwhile, down below, the ship's internal battle against water was already lost in the long-term sense, but still fought in the short-term sense, because engineers and crew in technical spaces would keep doing what skilled workers do, managing systems, monitoring changes, attempting to keep power and critical functions running as long as possible, because power is not just comfort, it is communication, it is lighting, it is coordination, it is the ability to keep the ship's internal world organized rather than immediately collapsing into darkness. This is the part of the story where the ship becomes more than a stage and starts becoming a problem you can physically feel, because as the angle increases, movement becomes harder, and people have to choose where to put their weight, and staircases feel steeper, and handrails become more important, and the ship's great size, once comforting, becomes intimidating. Because you realize how much distance exists between where you are and where you want to be, and you realize that distance is now slanted and crowded and full of confusion. The lifeboats remaining on board became more precious with each passing minute, because scarcity always changes behavior, and once people sensed scarcity, cooperation became more fragile. Not always because people become cruel, but because fear makes people protective, and protectiveness can look like selfishness from the outside, and at the same time, there were also moments of unusual kindness. Because crisis can bring out a strange clarity too, where someone realizes that helping another person is the only meaningful action left. Out on the water, the boats that had already launched formed a scattered ring of witnesses, and that ring matters because it created a second world, a world where people sat close together, cold and quiet, looking back at the Titanic, and the view from a lifeboat would have been surreal, because the ship was still huge, still lit, still elegant looking from a distance. And that elegance could make the situation feel like an impossible misunderstanding, like the ship was only pausing, only waiting, only dealing with a temporary inconvenience, and yet the longer you looked, the more you would notice subtle changes, the angle, the way the ship's posture no longer looked perfectly level against the line of the sea. The night itself stayed calm in a way that almost felt cruel, because calm weather is usually welcomed at sea, but here calmness removed the obvious external drama that might have made everyone believe the danger sooner, and instead, the ship had to convince people through its own slow failure, and slow failure is harder to believe than fast failure, because it gives the mind too much space to hope. The radio distress calls continued to matter, not because they could change the laws of time and distance, but because they were the only bridge between Titanic's situation and the wider sea, and the knowledge that at least one ship, the Carpathia, was making its way toward the distress position, created a painful kind of hope, because hope can calm people, but hope can also keep people waiting. And waiting is risky when the ship's condition is changing minute by minute. As the evacuation progressed into its later phase, the quality of information on board deteriorated in a predictable way, because earlier, the ship could still pretend to run like a system, but later, the system had too many moving parts under stress, so instructions became louder, more urgent, more direct, and the polite tone of luxury travel began to crack. Because a steward cannot keep sounding like a hotel employee when the ship's posture is telling everyone something else. The crowd's movement changed too, because early in the night people moved like curious travelers, later they moved like people who wanted answers quickly, and if you imagine that change across decks and corridors, you can almost feel the ship's emotional temperature rising, the way voices become sharper, the way questions become repetitive, the way people stop accepting "please" as a sufficient explanation and start demanding certainty. And certainty is the one thing a sinking ship cannot provide. At the same time, because it was still a ship full of social layers, you would have seen differences in how different groups experienced the last phase, because those closer to information and access had earlier chances to act, and those deeper inside the ship had to fight their way through structure and confusion, and when they finally reached the open deck, they were not entering a calm orderly world. They were entering a late-stage emergency where the remaining options were fewer and the urgency was more visible. This is also where the idea of orderly evacuation begins to lose its clean shape, not because everything becomes instant chaos, but because the ship's physical changes begin to interfere, and interference is the enemy of neat plans, because a plan assumes stable ground, stable timing, stable equipment, and stable human behavior, and stability was becoming rarer. Some of the last lifeboats were not launched in the same calm, ritual-like way as earlier boats, because time pressure changes everything. It changes how people climb, how they listen, how they argue, how they decide, and it can force choices that feel harsh, and in a tragedy like this, history later looks back and tries to measure every choice. But in the moment the people involved were mostly trying to do something simpler and harder at the same time, which is to act fast without losing control. And still, through all of this, the ship's lights remained for a while, the ship's huge body remained for a while, the ship's presence remained so strong that it could almost convince you it would last, because a large object still standing upright feels permanent, and the human brain loves permanence, it seeks it, it clings to it, and even as the Titanic situation grew worse, many people's minds kept reaching for the idea that it will hold on, because that idea is easier than accepting that the ship, the symbol, the plan, the schedule, the confident modern machine, was becoming a temporary thing. In the boats on the water, people would have been listening for sounds and watching for lights, not necessarily thinking in detailed predictions, but thinking in the basic language of survival: will help come, and how long will it take, and what will happen next, and is this really happening? And in that world, time becomes strange too, because minutes feel long, and silence feels heavy. And the distance between the boats and the ship can feel both too far and too close. The approach of rescue was still a future event, not yet visible in a comforting way, because even if Carpathia was on its way, it was still hours away, and those hours, for the people on Titanic, were not available, and that is the heart of the night, the mismatch between how quickly a ship can fail and how slowly help can arrive. In the next part, we will stay in the same calm, detailed tone as the night moves into its final stage for the Titanic itself, how the ship's posture becomes impossible to ignore, how the remaining people on board experience that narrowing of options, how the boats on the water watch the ship's lights and outline change, and how the story transitions from evacuation to aftermath, including how the rescue ship's arrival changes the emotional landscape, because rescue is not the end of fear, it is the beginning of processing what has happened. At some point in a slow disaster, the human mind stops trying to negotiate with reality, not because it becomes brave, but because the evidence becomes too physical to ignore, and on the Titanic that point arrived in stages, like the tightening of a knot you did not realize was being pulled, because the ship did not suddenly become a different object, it simply stopped behaving like the stable world people had paid for. And once a world stops behaving like itself, every small detail becomes suspicious, every creak becomes meaningful, every shift of weight becomes a message, and the ship begins to feel less like a place you inhabit and more like a thing you must escape. The deck, by then, was no longer just cold, it was a kind of cold that demanded attention, because cold at night makes your thoughts sharper in a narrow way, it reduces imagination and focuses you on immediate sensation, on breath, on hands, on the thinness of clothing, on the way the air bites at the face, and this physical discomfort interacted with fear in a complicated way. Because fear makes people heat up inside while the air pulls warmth away from them, and the result is a restless, uncomfortable energy, like being half awake and half trapped inside a thought you cannot finish. The ship's posture had changed enough that it was no longer a subtle rumor, it was something you could feel in your legs, something you could see in how objects sat, something you could sense in how crowds leaned without meaning to, and at that stage even people who had been calm earlier began to show it in their behavior, not necessarily by shouting, but by moving more quickly, by asking questions more urgently, by holding on to rails longer, by looking toward the lifeboats not as an odd precaution but as the central fact of the night. What is easy to forget when you only know Titanic as a famous story is how much of it was spent in a kind of in-between state, where the ship was still lit and still recognizable, where the social world still existed with its habits and its manners, but where those manners were now being used like a thin blanket against something much heavier, and you can picture people attempting to keep dignity because dignity was all they had left, and you can picture others abandoning dignity because survival is more persuasive than etiquette, and you can picture both reactions happening in the same space, side by side, because a ship is a compressed society and crises do not give people the luxury of distance. The remaining lifeboats became a narrowing doorway, and narrow doorways always change crowds, because when there is room for everyone, people can remain polite, but when there is not room for everyone, politeness becomes fragile, and it is not always replaced by cruelty, sometimes it is replaced by bargaining, by pleading, by arguments that circle the same point again and again, by people trying to interpret rules in ways that could favor them or favor someone they loved, and in those moments, the loudest sound is often not anger but desperation shaped into words. Crew members had to keep performing tasks that demanded precision even as the ship's environment became less stable, and this is a hard thing to picture unless you imagine the actual physical work, the handling of lines, the positioning of boats, the securing of equipment, the need to coordinate with other crew members in cold air while people pressed close, asking questions, making demands, hesitating, crying, or falling silent in the way people fall silent when they have run out of ideas. At the same time, the ship's internal systems were reaching their limits, and that included the things passengers had taken for granted since boarding: lighting, warmth, the sense that the ship's interior was a separate universe from the sea, and even before any major visible change, there is something psychologically important about realizing that comfort is not guaranteed anymore, because once comfort becomes uncertain, people begin to understand that the world they are standing in is not meant to last. Even the idea of help began to feel strange, because help is a word that sounds immediate in ordinary life. You call for help and someone arrives, you have a problem and a service exists, but on the ocean, help is measured in distance and in hours, and that night the meaning of help was limited by physics, by the speed of ships, by the cold, by darkness, by the presence of ice that made rushing itself dangerous. And it meant that even when a rescue ship decided to come, the coming would be slow in the way all large moving objects are slow. The Carpathia, responding to distress signals, was moving toward Titanic's position, and that movement mattered as a fact and as a symbol, because it was the outside world turning itself toward the emergency, but it could not instantly rewrite time, and that created a gap between hope and reality, a gap where people had to survive without knowing whether the gap would be crossed in time, and when humans face gaps like that, they tend to cling to small certainties, like the warmth of someone's hand, like a familiar voice, like the simple act of staying near a railing and repeating, quietly, what they are going to do next. Out on the water, in the boats that had already launched, the scene was both clearer and more unreal, because distance can clarify shape while also making everything feel like a dream, and from a lifeboat you could look back and see a giant liner that still seemed too large to disappear, still bright against the dark sea, still shaped like a confident human idea, and yet you could also see that it was not level, that it was changing. And those changes can be hard for the mind to accept because the mind wants the ship to stay the ship, it wants consistency, and consistency was being taken away minute by minute. People in the boats would have been listening and watching, not only for the Titanic, but for any sign of another ship, any light on the horizon that would prove rescue was close, and in that waiting the ocean becomes a very different place, because the ocean at night is mostly soundless, mostly textureless, mostly a dark presence that you cannot fight and cannot reason with, and when you are surrounded by it, your mind starts measuring time by small things, by the way wind shifts, by the way someone breathes, by the way a boat gently moves, by the way you can no longer tell whether you have been sitting for 10 minutes or an hour. Back on the Titanic, the crowd on deck thinned in some areas and thickened in others, and that pattern is a sign of a system approaching its end, because people gather where they believe options still exist, and they abandon places that no longer offer hope, and this creates a kind of tragic migration across a ship, where movement is no longer about curiosity or leisure but about proximity to the last remaining chances. It is also important to understand how difficult it is for a person to decide that a huge ship is truly failing, because the ship is large enough to feel like architecture, and architecture is something we assume will not change quickly, so even when evidence is present, the mind keeps trying to delay the conclusion, and that delay can look like stubbornness or denial. But it is also the mind protecting itself from a reality too large to fit into one thought. As the final stage approached, the ship's mood stopped being a single mood and became a set of moods stacked together, urgency in one place, confusion in another, quiet resignation in another, and the contrast between these moods is part of why the story feels so complicated, because there was no single unified crowd, there were many crowds, many small groups, each with different information, different access, different physical position on the ship, and therefore different reality. Officers and crew had to continue making choices in conditions that were no longer stable, choices about how to manage remaining equipment, how to direct people, how to preserve what order was still possible, and it is worth noticing how much of Titanic's tragedy is built from the fact that a ship is not only a vehicle, it is a structure, and changing a structure under stress is not like turning a car, it is slow, it is heavy, it is resistant, and it can trap people in places they did not expect to be trapped. The last moments of normal ship life were not marked by a single dramatic event that everyone experienced at the same second, they were marked by a gradual breakdown of assumption, the assumption that lights stay on, that floors stay level, that the ship remains an unquestioned refuge, and once those assumptions fell away, what remained was the raw understanding that the ocean was now the surrounding truth, and the ship was no longer a guarantee. In the boats, people who had been reluctant to leave earlier now looked back with a different kind of awareness, because once you are off the ship, you realize how much you depended on it, and you also realize that the ship is not simply a ship, it is an entire organized environment, and losing it means losing the rules that make life predictable, and predictability is one of the deepest human comforts. And so the story moves toward aftermath, toward the long cold waiting for rescue, toward the gradual arrival of help, toward the moment when lights on the horizon become more than hope and start becoming a real presence, and that transition is not instantly soothing, because rescue does not erase what people have already felt, rescue does not return the lost calm, it simply changes the problem from, how do we survive this minute, to, how do we live with what just happened? In the next part, we will focus on that aftermath in a slow, detailed way, what it was like in the lifeboats as time stretched, how people tried to keep each other organized, how the night began turning toward morning, how the Carpathia's approach changed behavior, how the rescue itself unfolded as a series of small actions rather than a single cinematic moment, and how the world, once daylight returned, looked completely different than it had looked at dinner, because daylight has a cruel honesty, it shows you what night allowed you to half believe. Once you were in a lifeboat, the Titanic became something you could look at rather than something that surrounded you, and that distance changed the mind in a strange way, because when a danger is close, the mind is busy with immediate decisions, where to step, what to hold, what to do next, but when danger is at a distance, the mind has room to think, and thinking can be heavier than action, because thinking invites you to imagine outcomes you cannot control. The lifeboats were small worlds, each one a narrow strip of wood and rope and crowded bodies, each one surrounded by black water that did not reflect much light, and the cold was not an abstract idea anymore, it was the air itself, it was the way your breath felt sharp, it was the way fingers lost feeling quickly unless they were kept moving, it was the way clothing that seemed warm inside the ship now felt thin and insufficient, and the sea, calm on the surface, still carried that deeper cold. That made people instinctively avoid any contact with it, even a splash. People sat close together, not only because the boats were cramped, but because closeness is a human method of survival, and even if you do not speak to the person beside you, the fact that their shoulder is there makes the world feel less empty, and emptiness at sea is frightening because it removes reference points, it removes walls, it removes streets and lamps and familiar edges, and replaces them with an endless dark plain that makes you feel both tiny and exposed. The people in the boats did not all share the same understanding of what was happening, because some had been told little, some had seen more, some had guessed the truth earlier, some were still trying to believe that the ship would remain afloat long enough for everyone to be saved, and this unevenness created a quiet tension, because when you do not know whether you are in a temporary inconvenience or a true disaster, you do not know what emotions are appropriate, and so you may hear someone speaking too calmly, as if nothing is wrong, while someone else cannot stop shaking, and both reactions can coexist without either one being wrong, because the mind processes shock at different speeds. Some lifeboats had crew members guiding them, and in those boats the atmosphere could be slightly more organized, because a crew member knows that the first job is to get away from the ship, to avoid being pulled in by suction if the ship goes down, to keep the boat from being smashed against the larger vessel, and to maintain a safe position while waiting. But even when there was guidance, guidance could not cancel out the emotional weight of the view, because the Titanic, still lit for much of the night, still looked like a floating city, and a floating city is hard to believe can disappear. And so people looked back, again and again, not because they wanted to torture themselves, but because the human eye seeks certainty, and the only certainty available was the shape of the ship against the dark, and the ship's shape was changing slowly, and slow change is difficult, because it makes you question your own perception, it makes you wonder whether you are imagining it, whether the angle is truly greater than before, whether the lights are dimmer or it is just your eyes, whether time is passing faster or slower than you think. The sea was quiet enough that sound traveled in an odd way, and voices across the water could sometimes be heard faintly, not clearly like conversation, but as distant human noise, and that distant human noise can feel haunting because it reminds you that you are not alone, yet you are separated, and separation is one of the most painful sensations humans experience, because it creates helplessness. And helplessness is what disaster often produces, the sense that you can see a problem but cannot reach it, cannot change it, cannot fix it with effort or intelligence or kindness. In the lifeboats, time stretched, and when time stretches, the mind begins to count in different units, not minutes but sensations, the sensation of cold becoming stronger, the sensation of muscles stiffening, the sensation of fear returning after a brief lull, the sensation of hope rising whenever someone thinks they see a light on the horizon, and then the sensation of disappointment when the light is only a star or only a reflection or only a trick of the eye. People try to stay warm in ways that sound small but matter deeply, by tucking hands into sleeves, by pressing closer, by pulling coats tighter, by wrapping scarves over mouths so the breath warmed the fabric, by shifting weight so legs did not fall asleep, by rubbing arms, by whispering short sentences, because speaking keeps the body engaged and keeps the mind from sinking inward too far. Somewhere in the scattered field of lifeboats, there would have been pockets of quiet conversation, people telling each other names, or asking whether anyone had seen a relative, or promising to stay together if possible, and promises like that can be both comforting and painful, because they carry the implication that separation might happen anyway, and the mind hates uncertain promises, yet clings to them because the alternative is to accept that you are alone in a cold world. For some, the mind kept returning to the same question: where is help? Where is the rescue ship? When will it arrive? And the problem is that on the ocean, when is not easily felt, because there are no road signs, no approaching engine noise that grows steadily louder, no sense of an ambulance turning the corner. There is only horizon, and the horizon is stubbornly empty until it is not. The Carpathia was coming, and this is one of the crucial facts of the night, because it means the story is not only loss, it is also response, but even response has its own slow rhythm, because Carpathia had to receive the distress signal, understand it, decide, change course, increase speed, and then travel through a night that was dangerous in the same way Titanic's night had been dangerous, with ice in the region, with cold air, with darkness, and a captain who had to balance urgency against the risk of creating a second disaster. It is easy, later, to imagine Carpathia as a simple savior arriving on cue, but in reality it was a ship moving through conditions that did not care about heroism, and that meant the rescue itself was a negotiation with the Atlantic, and negotiations with the Atlantic are slow, because the ocean does not make exceptions. It does not speed up because humans are desperate. It does not soften because the story is tragic. It remains itself. As the hours passed, the Titanic's lights, which had been a kind of fragile comfort, eventually became part of the horror, because light makes things look stable, but light can also highlight the moment stability breaks, and when the ship's lights changed, or when certain lights went out, or when the pattern looked different, people in the boats would have felt that change like a message traveling through their bodies. Because you can lie to yourself about many things, but you cannot easily lie to yourself about a world going darker. And still, in that waiting, human beings did what they always do. They tried to create structure, because structure is an antidote to fear, so they counted people, they checked who had what clothing, they tried to share blankets or coats if anyone had extra, they spoke of staying alert, of not letting anyone slump too deeply into cold stillness, of watching the horizon for lights, of keeping the boat facing a certain way. Because even a small task can give the mind a place to rest. The ocean, calm as it was, still moved the boats gently, and that gentle movement can feel like a lullaby at first, but then it becomes a reminder that you are not on stable ground, that you cannot get up and walk away, that your world is now a floating platform, and floating platforms are never truly still. Some people, in that long darkness, likely replayed the last hour on the ship in their minds, not because they wanted to, but because the mind repeats shocks until it can make sense of them, and sense is what the mind demands, so it replays details, the moment they were told to come on deck, the moment they hesitated, the moment they stepped into the boat, the moment they looked back, the moment they realized the ship was not simply damaged, it was doomed, and each replay carries a quiet question: could I have done something different? And that question is painful because it offers the illusion of control after the fact. Then, slowly, the night began to thin, and the thinning of night is one of the most emotionally complex transitions in such a scene, because dawn is usually a promise. Dawn means survival, dawn means the end of darkness, but dawn also brings visibility, and visibility means you will see what you have been half protecting yourself from. You will see the open water, you will see the scattered boats, you will see faces more clearly, you will see the absence of the great ship you trusted, and daylight can feel like a cold honesty that the mind is not ready for. As the sky lightened, the horizon became clearer, and with clarity came both hope and dread, because now you could search properly for rescue, now you could judge distances more accurately, now you could see whether a light is a star or a ship, and you could also see how empty the sea still was, and emptiness can be discouraging. And yet, at some point, the rescue ship did become visible, not necessarily as a dramatic close-up, but as a distant shape, a darker line against a lighter sky, and that moment, when someone in a lifeboat realizes that a ship is truly coming, can trigger a wave of emotion that is hard to describe, because it contains relief, and also grief, and also exhaustion, and also an almost childlike desire to be back in a world where help arrives quickly, where land exists, where buildings do not sink. Carpathia approached the scene with the caution required by ice, and caution can feel slow to those waiting, but it is the kind of slowness that saves lives, because a rescue ship that strikes ice becomes another disaster, and so Carpathia's arrival was the arrival of help inside constraints, help that still had to be careful, help that still had to work step by step. The rescue itself was not a single moment, it was a process, and processes are long, and when you have been cold and frightened for hours, any process feels endless, because the body wants warmth now, the mind wants certainty now, and now is a word the ocean rarely respects. Lifeboats had to be found, approached, and brought close enough for people to transfer safely, and transferring from a small boat to a larger ship is not an effortless act, especially when bodies are stiff with cold and minds are crowded with shock, and so the rescue became a series of small human movements, hands reaching, ropes being secured, steps taken carefully, people being lifted or guided, words of reassurance spoken again and again, because reassurance is another kind of rope, it connects you back to humanity. A rescue ship is also its own world of discipline, and Carpathia's crew would have had to organize quickly, to create spaces for survivors, to provide warmth, to offer drinks, to find blankets, to manage the flow of exhausted people, and that management matters, because after chaos, good management feels like a miracle, the simple miracle of someone knowing what to do next. For those being rescued, stepping onto the Carpathia would have been a psychological border crossing, because it meant leaving the lifeboat behind, leaving the cold open sea behind, leaving the long night behind, and entering a new contained environment where the floor is larger, the lights are steadier, the crew is active, and the idea of safety begins to reappear, though not as comfort yet, because shock does not vanish instantly. It lingers like an echo. People would have looked at each other differently in that moment, because once you are on the rescue ship, you start to see the event not as, we might be saved, but as, this has happened, and that shift is heavy, because it turns fear into grief, it turns adrenaline into exhaustion, and exhaustion is often when the mind finally allows itself to feel. As morning grew brighter, the sea itself looked different, because daylight reveals the true color of water, the true emptiness of horizon, the presence of ice in a way darkness hides, and seeing ice in daylight can make the previous night feel more real, because the hazard is now visible as a physical fact rather than an abstract threat. The survivors were brought aboard in waves, boat by boat, and each boat carried its own small story, its own combination of silence and crying, its own collection of people who had experienced the same night but in slightly different ways, because even when two people share the same event, their minds record different details, and those differences can shape how they remember it for the rest of their lives. When the last boats were accounted for, Carpathia became a moving shelter carrying a crowd of exhausted minds, and the journey that followed was not only a journey to a port, it was a journey into the aftermath, into questions, into lists of names, into the painful inventory of who is present and who is not, because survival does not end the story, it begins a new part of it. A part where the mind tries to rebuild order after the old order has collapsed. And the Titanic, which had once been a schedule and a luxury environment and a proud symbol of modern confidence, became something else in memory, a night of cold air, of scattered boats, of distant lights, of waiting, of rescue arriving slower than anyone wished, and of dawn revealing a world that could no longer pretend that progress had erased nature's power. In the next part, we will move into the immediate aftermath on Carpathia, the quiet logistics of caring for survivors, the emotional atmosphere aboard a ship suddenly transformed from a normal passenger vessel into a rescue sanctuary, and the slow approach to New York as news spreads ahead of them, because even before land appears, the world begins to react, and reaction becomes part of the story. But it never removes the quiet fact that the ocean, indifferent and calm, was the stage on which human confidence learned its limits.